The alarm inside my helmet screamed a warning I already understood without needing the translation chip. The shrine floor was cracking under the weight of something none of us were supposed to see fall. My name is Daniel Hartley, and 3 seconds earlier I had been standing quietly at the back of a crowd of alien nobles, holding a toolkit, waiting for my shift to end. Now the ancient sword above the altar was tipping sideways, its glow flickering like a dying heartbeat, and every alien in that hall was too frozen with shock to catch it. So I did the only thing that made sense. I moved. I was not supposed to be near the sword of Virel at all. Humans were guests on this world, tolerated, but never trusted. Useful for repairs and labor, but never invited into ceremonies that decided the fate of an empire. I had been sent to fix a failing power conduit beneath the shrine, nothing more. I was not a soldier chosen for glory. I was not a diplomat chosen for words. I was a technician with grease on my hands and a wrench in my belt, standing in the wrong place at exactly the right moment. The sword had rested untouched for 300 years, locked in a cradle of pale blue light at the center of the royal shrine on Threnvale. It was the blade of Queen Isaluna's bloodline, said to answer only to a ruler worthy of carrying the weight of her ancestors. Champions from a dozen powerful worlds had tried to lift it over the centuries. Warriors twice my height, nobles born into lines older than human civilization itself. Every one of them had failed, and the sword had punished some of them with a cold shock that left their hands numb for days. I had heard the stories from other humans stationed here, always told with a laugh, always followed by the same joke. Good thing they never let us try. We would probably break the poor thing just by looking at it wrong. Nobody was laughing an hour before the alarm went off, when I stood at the edge of the shrine watching the ceremony begin. The hall was carved from pale stone that seemed to breathe with faint light, and rows of alien dignitaries filled every seat, their long robes rustling like wind through dry grass. At the center of it all stood Queen Isaluna, silver-skinned, tall, her eyes the color of storm clouds, watching as one more champion approached her family's sword. He was a Dravith warrior named Corin, built like a wall, arms thick enough to crush stone. He gripped the hilt with both hands and pulled. The blade did not move. Light rippled across its surface, and Corin's fingers seized up as if frostbite had struck him instantly. He staggered back, cradling his hand, and the crowd murmured with a mixture of pity and quiet satisfaction. Another failure, another proof that the sword belonged to no one currently alive. I remember thinking none of this concerned me. I was there to fix a conduit that kept overheating beneath the platform. A small technical problem in the middle of a very large political show. The Virellan engineers had asked for human help because our repair drones were smaller and faster than theirs, able to slip into gaps their own equipment could not reach. So while champions failed one after another above me, I knelt below the platform, adjusting wiring, half listening to the ceremony through the vibration in the floor. That is when the real trouble started. The power surge came without warning. A conduit I had just stabilized suddenly spiked, sending a shockwave through the crystal lattice that held the sword suspended above the altar. I felt the floor shudder under my knees. Above me, gasps spread through the crowd. I scrambled out from beneath the platform just in time to see the pale blue light around the sword flicker and collapse. The blade began to fall. Nobody moved, not the guards, not the nobles, not even Queen Isaluna, whose face had gone pale with something between fear and disbelief. 300 years of tradition told them the sword could not be touched by hands unworthy of it, and in that instant of shock, tradition became paralysis. They stood frozen while an ancient and priceless weapon tumbled toward the stone floor. I was standing closest, still holding my tools, still covered in dust from the crawl space below. My body reacted before my mind finished processing the danger. I lunged forward and caught the hilt with both hands before it could shatter against the ground. The moment my palm closed around it, the sword lit up like a struck match. Warmth spread from my hand up through my arm, not painful, not cold like the stories described, but steady, almost gentle, like a hand closing around mine in return. The blue light around the blade brightened, then shifted color entirely, becoming a warm gold that had never been seen in 3 centuries of failed attempts. The hum inside the metal matched the rhythm of my own pulse, beat for beat, as if the sword had been waiting to hear a heartbeat it recognized. The entire hall went silent. I looked up, sword still in my hands, and found every eye in the room fixed on me. Queen Isaluna had risen from her seat, one hand pressed to her chest, staring at me the way someone stares at a ghost they never expected to see again. Guards who had ignored my presence moments earlier now watched me with expressions somewhere between confusion and alarm. I did what any reasonable person would do in that situation. I said the first thing that came to mind. I did not mean to catch it, I told them. It was just falling, and I did not want it to break. Nobody laughed, Nobody moved. The silence stretched long enough that I started to wonder if I had somehow broken an unspoken rule simply by speaking in a sacred hall. Queenie Saluna stepped down from her platform slowly, her robes trailing behind her like liquid silver. She approached me with careful steps, studying the golden glow still wrapped around the blade in my hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, meant only for those close enough to hear. "That light has not shone in 300 years, she said. Not for kings, not for warriors, not for anyone." I did not know what to say to that, so I said the honest thing. "I am not a king or a warrior, Your Majesty. I am just a technician who happened to be standing in the wrong place." A murmur rippled through the crowd, half of them offended by my casual tone, half of them too stunned to react at all. One of the older nobles, a thin, gray-robed figure named Velkar who had spent years advising the queen, stepped forward with obvious anger tightening his voice. "This is an outrage," he said. "A human should not even be permitted inside this shrine, let alone touch the royal blade. This must be some trick of human technology, some device hidden in his gloves." I raised my hand slowly, showing my bare palms, the sword still glowing gently where I had set it down on the altar rather than continue holding it in front of an audience that seemed ready to accuse me of treason. There was no device. There was no trick. There was only a falling sword and a person close enough to catch it. Queen Isaluna held up one hand, and the hall fell silent again immediately. Proof of exactly how much authority she carried, even in a moment of confusion. "Bring the archivists," she said. "I want the old records searched. Every scroll, every carving, every fragment of history from before the founding of this shrine." The search took hours. I was asked to remain in a side chamber under guard, though the guards seemed more nervous around me than threatening, unsure how to treat someone who had just done what generations of their strongest warriors could not. I sat on a stone bench, turning the strange moment over in my mind, trying to make sense of a magic sword responding to an ordinary human hand. It was well into the evening when Velkar returned, his anger from earlier replaced by something closer to disbelief. He explained what the archivists had found buried deep within records nobody had bothered to translate in centuries, written in a dialect so old that most scholars assumed it held nothing but ceremonial poetry. The founder of Queen Isaluna's bloodline, a warrior named Sael Varel, had not ruled alone. Long before the shrine existed, before the Varellan Empire expanded across a dozen star systems, Sael had formed a bond with a traveler from a distant, unknown world. The old texts described this traveler using a word that translated roughly into stubborn one, a being small in stature compared to most species of that era, yet possessing a will that refused to break under any pressure. According to the records, Sael had commissioned the sword not for combat, but as a symbol of that partnership, embedding within its metal a resonance keyed to a very specific trait, rather than to noble blood as everyone had assumed for 300 years. The sword was never meant to recognize kings. It was meant to recognize a particular kind of spirit, one defined by persistence rather than power, patience rather than pride. "The stubborn one from a distant world," Velkar read aloud, his voice quieter now, almost reverent. "The one who did not bow to storms, who did not yield to fear, who carried burdens without complaint, and returned always to finish what was started." He looked up at me then, and for the first time since I had caught the falling blade, his expression held no anger at all. "We assumed for centuries that this described a hero from our own history, lost to time," he said. "We never imagined it could describe an entire species that had not yet arrived among the stars." Queen Isaluna listened to this explanation with quiet intensity, her storm-gray eyes fixed on the sword resting on the altar, still glowing faintly gold. When Velkar finished, she turned to me with a question I had not expected. "Do the people of your world understand what stubbornness truly costs?" she asked. "Or what it earns?" I thought about that question honestly before answering. I thought about every human who had ever kept working through exhaustion, every engineer who refused to give up on a failing system, every soldier who held a line simply because retreating was not an option they were willing to accept. I thought about how humanity had clawed its way into space, using technology far less advanced than the empires surrounding us, not because we were naturally gifted, but because we refused to stop trying. "We understand it very well, Your Majesty," I told her. "It is mostly all we have." Something in her expression softened at that answer, and for a moment the weight of ceremony and politics seemed to fall away entirely, leaving only two people standing near an ancient sword, trying to understand what history had just handed them. The following morning, word of what happened had already spread across the capital. I woke in guest quarters far nicer than anything a technician like me was normally given, summoned before I had even finished my morning meal to appear again before the Queen and her full council. The hall was more crowded than the day before. filled now not just with nobles but with representatives from other alien worlds who had heard rumors and traveled quickly to see if they were true. Queen Isaluna stood before them all, the sword resting in a new cradle of light beside her throne, still glowing faintly gold. For 300 years, she announced, this blade has waited for someone worthy to claim the bond forged by my ancestor. Many believed that worthiness meant strength, or bloodline, or noble birth. Yesterday, we learned otherwise. She turned toward me, and every eye in the room followed her gaze. Daniel Hartley of Earth did not seek this bond, she continued. He did not fight for it, or scheme for it, or believe himself deserving of it. He simply acted when action was needed, without hesitation, without pride, expecting nothing in return. That, more than any bloodline, is what my ancestor sought when this sword was forged. Murmurs spread through the crowd again, though this time the tone had shifted from suspicion toward something closer to grudging respect. Velkar, standing near the throne, gave a small nod in my direction, which from him felt like a genuine gesture of acceptance. I want to be honest with all of you, I said, stepping forward despite every instinct telling me to stay quiet and let the moment pass without my involvement. I am not a hero. I am not special among my people. There are millions of humans who would have done exactly what I did if they had been standing in my place. We do not train for legendary moments. We simply refuse to let things fall when we are close enough to catch them. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through parts of the crowd, not mocking, but warm, the kind of laughter that comes from recognizing honesty in an unexpected place. Even Queen Isaluna allowed herself a small smile. Perhaps that is precisely the point, she said. Perhaps greatness was never about standing above others, but about refusing to stand aside. In the weeks that followed, everything around the shrine changed. The old law barring humans from ceremonial grounds was quietly rewritten. Human technicians and soldiers stationed on Threnvale, once treated as convenient labor and little else, began receiving invitations to councils and gatherings once closed entirely to our kind. It was not a sudden transformation into equals, not overnight, but the first real crack in a wall that had stood far longer than anyone alive could remember. I was offered a formal title, something like Guardian of the Bond, along with quarters inside the royal complex, and a place among the Queen's closest advisors. I turned most of it down, gently, explaining that my life had never been built around titles or palaces, and that I would rather return to the work I understood, fixing what was broken, keeping systems running, being useful in the way I knew how to be useful. Queen Isaluna did not seem offended by my answer. If anything, she seemed to expect it. That too is part of the old description, she said, when I explained my decision. The stubborn one returns always to finish what was started. You are simply proving the ancient words correct once more. I kept a small connection to the shrine after that day, visiting occasionally when duty allowed, standing quietly near the sword that still carried a faint golden glow whenever I was close enough to touch it. I never claimed to fully understand the bond described in those old texts, and I never pretended the moment made me anything more than an ordinary person who happened to be standing in the right place at exactly the wrong time. But something had shifted, not just for me, but for every human working on that world and for those who would come after. The story spread beyond Threnvale eventually, carried by traders and diplomats to other systems, growing a little larger with each retelling, though I always tried to correct the exaggerations whenever I heard them repeated. No, I did not fight a beast to reach the sword. No, there was no prophecy written specifically about my name. There was simply a falling blade, an empty space where hesitation should have been, and hands that moved without waiting for permission. Sometimes late at night, working alone in some maintenance corridor far from the golden glow of that ancient shrine, I found myself thinking about Sael Virel, and the stubborn traveler from an unknown world who inspired a legend 3 centuries before humanity ever left its own solar system. I wondered if that traveler had felt as ordinary in the moment as I did, catching a sword that was never supposed to answer to hands like mine. Maybe that was the entire lesson buried inside the old texts, waiting patiently for 300 years until the right hand finally reached out to claim it. Greatness rarely announces itself with trumpets and prophecy. Sometimes it simply refuses to let something fall, quietly, without asking whether it is allowed to help. I never went looking for a legend. I was only trying to catch a sword before it hit the ground. It turned out that was exactly what history had been waiting for all along.